I didn't find out because of a warning. There was no alert, no call, no message saying something was wrong. I found out because I needed the money. It was a normal morning, nothing dramatic. I was standing in line at the grocery store, cart half full, thinking about what I still had to get done that day. When I reached the counter, I paid the way I always did, without thinking. The screen paused. Then it declined. I tried again, embarrassed but calm. Sometimes machines glitch. Declined. The cashier looked at me, waiting. People behind me shifted. I felt that familiar heat in my face, the kind that comes from being unexpectedly exposed. "I'm sorry," I said, stepping aside. "Let me check something." I pulled out my phone, expecting a simple explanation. Maybe a daily limit, maybe a temporary hold. What I saw didn't make sense. The balance was 0. Not low, not pending, empty. I stared at the screen, refreshing it like the number might change if I gave it enough time. My heart sped up, but my body stayed still. I remember how quiet everything felt in that moment, like the world had pulled back to watch my reaction. This couldn't be right. That account wasn't something I checked every day, but it was supposed to be there. It always had been. It was the account things flowed through: bills, groceries, normal life. I paid with another card, nodded politely, and walked out like nothing had happened. But something had already shifted. In the car, I checked again, and again. I logged out, logged back in, convinced it had to be an error. Still 0. No recent activity explained it, no clear transfers I recognized, just gone. I sat there longer than I meant to, gripping the steering wheel, replaying the last few weeks in my head. Had I missed something? Had there been a conversation I hadn't paid attention to? A decision I didn't remember agreeing to? I hadn't been careless, but I also hadn't been involved. That realization hit harder than the missing money. Someone else handled the accounts. That was how it had slowly become. It started as help, then efficiency, then habit. I trusted updates instead of checking. I listened to summaries instead of statements. "It's taken care of," I'd been told. "Everything's fine. You don't need to worry about it." And I hadn't. Until now. When I asked about it later, the answer came quickly. Too quickly. "Oh, I moved that money," they said. "Moved it where?" I asked. There was a pause. "It's complicated," they replied, "but it's fine." Fine. That word landed differently this time. Because if it were fine, I wouldn't be standing there trying to understand why I suddenly couldn't access my own money. I asked for details, not accusing, just asking. The explanation came in pieces. A transfer here, a decision there, something about timing, something about priorities. None of it felt urgent enough to explain why I hadn't been told. Or asked. I went to bed that night with a strange feeling. Not panic, but alertness. Like my body had recognized a threat before my mind had fully named it. This wasn't just about money. It was about discovery. About realizing that something important had changed without my knowledge, and that I had allowed that change by stepping back, by trusting without visibility, by choosing comfort over involvement. The account was empty before I knew. And the worst part wasn't the number on the screen. It was the understanding that I didn't know how long I'd been standing outside of my own financial life. That was the moment everything stopped being abstract. Because once you see that clearly, you don't just worry about where the money went, you start asking how much else you don't know, and whether this was the first surprise, or just the first one you noticed. I didn't confront it right away, not because I was afraid, but because I needed to understand what I was dealing with before I reacted. Shock makes you loud. Clarity makes you careful. I wanted careful. So I started paying attention. I listened differently when money came up. I noticed how answers were framed, what was explained and what was skipped. I asked small, neutral questions, the kind that don't trigger defensiveness. Can you show me where it went? When did that happen? Which account is it in now? Each question got an answer, but never the same kind of answer twice. Sometimes it was vague, sometimes it was technical. Sometimes it came with a reminder of how busy things had been, how stressful decisions were, how I didn't need to worry. That phrase again, you don't need to worry. I realized something uncomfortable. The words were meant to calm me, but the effect was to keep me uninformed. I went back through old emails and messages. I wasn't looking for proof, just patterns. I found references to decisions I didn't remember agreeing to, conversations summarized after they'd already happened. I noticed how often I'd replied with a simple, okay, trusting that details weren't necessary. Trust had turned into shorthand. Late at night, after the house went quiet, I opened my laptop and started making notes. Dates, amounts, accounts I recognized and ones I didn't. I wasn't accusing anyone, not even in my own head. I was mapping. The map grew faster than I expected. Transfers that made sense on paper but not in timing, consolidations done for simplicity, accounts closed without my involvement, new ones opened with explanations delivered after the fact. Nothing illegal, nothing flashy, just decisions. Decisions made without me. The emotional part didn't hit all at once. It arrived in waves. First, confusion, then embarrassment, how had I not noticed this sooner? Then a steadier feeling that surprised me. Resolve. Because once you see the full shape of something, denial doesn't work anymore. I realized how much I'd been relying on tone instead of transparency. If someone sounded confident, I assumed things were under control. If they sounded annoyed by my questions, I backed off. I'd confused confidence with correctness, and annoyance with authority. I tested one more thing. I asked for direct access, not to take over, just to see. The response was immediate and sharp. Why do you suddenly need that? Don't you trust me? It's easier if one person handles this. Easier for whom? I didn't say it out loud, but the question stayed with me. Because ease is not the same as equity, and convenience is not the same as consent. I started to understand that this wasn't about a single account. It was about a dynamic that had formed quietly, reinforced by my silence and their certainty. The account being empty wasn't the problem. It was the symptom. The problem was that I had been removed from the process, slowly, politely, and with my cooperation. That realization hurt, but it also clarified something important. I wasn't powerless, I was uninformed, and that could change. I scheduled a meeting with a bank representative, on my own. I didn't announce it, I didn't frame it as a challenge, I simply showed up and asked questions. The answers were straightforward. The system worked exactly as designed. Access had been centralized, notifications had been redirected, authority had been streamlined. Again, nothing illegal, just efficient. When I left the bank, I felt lighter and heavier at the same time. Lighter because I finally understood what had happened. Heavier because I understood how long it had been happening. I thought back to that moment at the grocery store. The pause, the decline, the heat in my face. That hadn't been humiliation. It had been a wake-up call. I wasn't angry yet. I wasn't ready to confront anyone, but I was done pretending this was a misunderstanding that would resolve itself. Trust doesn't mean disappearing, and if something affects your life, your security, your future, you don't get to opt out of understanding it. Not anymore. I didn't know exactly what I would say or how the conversation would go, but I knew this. I wasn't going back to summaries and reassurances. I wanted a visibility. Because money doesn't just move through accounts. It moves through power. And I was ready to take my place back in that flow, calmly, deliberately, and with my eyes open. Once I understood what had happened, I couldn't go back to not knowing. The details I'd gathered didn't sit quietly anymore. They followed me through the day, while I drove, while I worked, while I nodded through conversations that suddenly felt rehearsed. I heard pauses where there used to be explanations. I noticed how decisions were framed as done, not discussed. It wasn't just the money. It was how easily my role had been minimized. I replayed the story I'd been telling myself, that this setup was practical, that it reduced stress, that it worked because things hadn't fallen apart. But stability built on exclusion isn't stability. It's a temporary calm that depends on silence. I realized how often I'd accepted reassurance instead of proof, how often I'd equated love with protection and protection with control. I'd told myself that letting go was mature, that trusting someone else to handle things meant I was secure. But security shouldn't require ignorance. The emotional shift happened before the conversation did. It happened quietly, one evening as I sat alone and read through the notes I'd made. There it was, in plain language, a timeline of decisions that affected me but didn't include me. I felt something settle in my chest. Not panic, not rage, clarity. I wasn't being dramatic. I wasn't overreacting. I wasn't imagining things. I was responding to facts. That realization steadied me. The next step wasn't confrontation, it was preparation. I reviewed access points, account names, policies. I made a list of what I needed: visibility, shared decision-making, and clear boundaries around changes that affected both of us. Nothing unreasonable, just equality. When I finally spoke, my voice surprised me. It didn't shake, it didn't rise. It was calm in a way that signaled I wasn't asking, I was stating. I need full access to our accounts, not summaries, not updates, access. There was a pause. "What brought this on?" they asked. I didn't mention the grocery store. I didn't list the transfers. I didn't accuse. I realized I don't know what's happening with my own money, and that's not okay anymore. The response came quickly, defensive, then explanatory. I was just trying to simplify things. You know I handle stress better. This is how it's always been. Always been. That phrase felt heavy, because always can quietly become never again if you don't interrupt it. I'm not saying you did something wrong, I said. I'm saying I need to be involved. The conversation didn't resolve neatly. There was tension. There were moments where I could feel the pull to retreat, to smooth things over, to reassure them that I wasn't trying to take anything away. But that wasn't true. I was taking something back. The days that followed were uncomfortable. Access was granted, but slowly. Explanations came, but with resistance. There was a sense of loss on the other side, a shift in control that couldn't be undone without acknowledgement. And I understood that too. Power rarely gives itself back easily, even when it was never meant to be taken in the first place. What surprised me was how grounded I felt through it all. Once the facts were on the table, the fear lost its grip. I didn't need to dramatize anything. The reality spoke for itself. I saw the full picture now, not just where the money had gone, but how the structure had been built step by step with my consent through absence. That understanding was painful, but it was also freeing. Because if I had participated in creating this dynamic, I could participate in changing it. I wasn't trying to rewrite the past. I was deciding how the future would work. I didn't know yet what the final arrangement would look like. I didn't know how long it would take to rebuild balance, but I knew I wouldn't go back to not knowing. The account being empty had startled me, but what followed was more important. I had found my voice, not in anger, not in accusation, but in clarity. And once clarity enters a conversation, it changes everything. This wasn't about money anymore. It was about standing fully in my own life, aware, informed, and unwilling to disappear again. Rebuilding trust didn't happen with one conversation. It happened in quiet moments, logging in together, reviewing statements side by side, asking questions that once would have felt uncomfortable. It happened when decisions slowed down enough to be discussed instead of executed. It happened when visibility replaced assumption. There were awkward days, days when the air felt heavier than usual, days when explanations sounded defensive, days when I wondered if it would have been easier to stay silent. But I remembered the grocery store, the decline, the stillness, and I stayed present. We restructured things carefully. Access became shared. Notifications came to both of us. Large decisions required conversation. Not permission, not approval, but agreement. It wasn't dramatic, it was practical. And it changed everything. Not because money suddenly felt exciting or empowering, but because it stopped feeling distant. I knew where things were. I understood how decisions were made. I could see the full picture without asking for it. That knowledge brought a kind of calm I hadn't expected. I also had to confront my own role in what had happened, not to blame myself, but to be honest. I had chosen ease over engagement. I had accepted reassurance instead of clarity. I had stepped back when things felt complicated instead of stepping in. That doesn't make me careless, it makes me human. Many of us are taught, quietly, that money is stressful, that it's better left to someone better at it, that asking too many questions creates tension, especially in relationships, especially when trust feels easier than conflict. But silence isn't neutral. Silence shapes outcomes. What I learned is this: involvement doesn't mean control. It means awareness. It means being able to say yes or no with information, not pressure. It means knowing that if something changes, you'll know before it affects you. Over time, the tension softened, not because everything was perfect, but because everything was visible. We disagreed sometimes, we adjusted, we learned new habits, but I never felt excluded again. The account that was empty eventually recovered. Funds were redistributed, systems were corrected, life moved forward. But the bigger change wasn't financial, it was internal. I stopped assuming that trust required absence. I stopped equating calm with compliance. I stopped shrinking to keep things smooth. I became involved, not aggressively, not fearfully, but intentionally. If I could speak to the version of myself who stood in that grocery store staring at her phone, I would tell her this: you're not overreacting. You're not behind. You're not wrong for wanting to understand. Money touches safety, stability, choice, and no one should be surprised by its absence. The account was empty before I knew, but now I know. I know where things stand, I know how decisions are made, I know that my presence in the process matters, not because I don't trust, but because trust works best in the open. This story isn't about loss, it's about awareness. And awareness, once gained, doesn't disappear. It changes how you move, how you speak, how you protect your future. I didn't lose everything that day. I found something. My place back in my own life. I didn't lose money because I was careless. I lost visibility before I realized it. If this story felt familiar, you're not alone. Comment, "I want to know," like if this made you think, share with someone who needs this reminder, and subscribe for more real American life stories.